Fascists, you'll notice in the pictures, they never clap for themselves. And the reason why is because it's them who did it, right? So they just soak in the applause, right? But if you look at Stalin, he always claps for himself in the videos because he is only the representative of the people, right? So when you clap, when Stalin claps, he's clapping for himself and therefore for the people. So, right? Watch him when they clap. Okay, I'm a little brain dead because I've been doing Club Rush for 2 days and I've been super busy, so I'm not as prepared as I'd like. So bear with me with that wonderful introduction. And I'm going to give a theory lecture on capitalism. Capitalism remains the dominant ideology in our world. And I would like to primarily deal with the vast theoretical implications of capitalism. But first, I must clarify and demystify some of the capitalist myths. Once these myths have been dispelled, I would like to deal with the concrete functioning of capitalism in its three primary modes or forms: in production, political economy, and ideology. So capitalism tells stories about its own origin. The stories range from the belief that even animals practice capitalism to the libertarian belief that real capitalism has never been seen on the earth. However, the usual story that you'll get from most people who tell the myth of capitalism goes something like this. Individuals found themselves good at different jobs, so they decided to trade things with each other rather than do things that they're bad at, so everyone could end up better off. Soon enough, people realized if they had money, then you could exchange it for various goods and services, and it would be a great deal easier than the barter system. And very quickly after, people began working for their own benefit, and thus capitalism arrives on the earth. The only problem with this narrative is that it never happened and it never existed. Roughly speaking, the first system before capitalism was feudalism. Most forms of feudalism had a variation of the estate system, which means that individuals were unimportant, and the state concerned itself with the estates or classes. And so you would have an aristocratic estate. You would have a clergy as an estate. You would have everyone else as an estate. But as a matter of fact, there was not this individual liberal notion of the individual as the core identity or of political will. Moreover, trade did not exist for individuals' well-being and desires. Instead, trade, for the most part, existed as a form of warfare, basically known as mercantilism, between different states. The conception was, if one state was richer, another state had to be poorer. And one would trade goods to ensure that one could take more gold for the enemy in order to put one's nation in an advantageous position in the event of the outbreak of war. None of these conditions have anything to do with the myth that capitalists try to tell about the origin of capitalism. So capitalism comes from this condition, not self-motivated, rational individuals pursuing their own self-interest, right? So that's a very important distinction. Moreover, capitalism does not stand as a force against the state, but exists historically in cooperation with the state. The capitalists have used the state to destroy common property, like grazing pastures all over Europe at the end of the feudal era. The seizure of property by the state allowed for larger productive capitalist farms in opposition to subsistence farming that usually happened under feudalism and the poorer growers. Moreover, capitalism requires the state to exercise imperialism. Capitalism needed to use the state for imperialism against the native peoples of Americas. You have the Spanish state engaging in imperialism and colonialism. You have the English and then American state exercising genocide against the native peoples in America. You also have the state exercising and assisting in capitalist enterprises in Africa, in India, in order to gain the wealth necessary to kickstart the capitalist consumer economy. In addition, the state, previously and currently, remains necessary to prop up the core institutions of capitalism. Historically, English capitalism required the state support to keep the English East India Company in operation. That corporation that really was a boon to English capitalists, or at least England as a country and ergo its capitalist class, had constant state intervention and the granting of special rights, the granting of special privileges, the exercise of Her Majesty's Navy and the royal forces in order to protect the interests of the East India Trading Company, or its various names. The American state, of course, also propped up American capitalism through charters used for the building of canals, of turnpikes, of roads, and even today, the state protects capitalism by allowing for corporations. Corporations are a government function. It is a protection of capitalists, right, their personal wealth, by allowing them to incorporate and only be responsible for the wealth invested in that actual corporation. So rather than being against the state, right, corporations only exist because of state laws and state protections. And then, of course, there's the obvious radical protection of the state, which is that the capitalists use the police and military to protect their interests. So, again, the core of this is we should reject all the myths that capitalists tell about their own origins. And we should look historically into how capitalism actually arose in its functioning over time. But it was not through individual self-interest and enlightened trade between other individuals. For the analysis of capitalism, I'm primarily going to turn to Marx. Marx gives us, because he gives us a radical insight into capitalist production above and beyond other capitalists, although very brilliant economists like Smith and Ricardo, he manages to bring it together in a way that is substantive and unique over other economists and philosophers and sociologists. So basically, capitalist production rests on 5 primary factors. We have use value, we have exchange value, we have the special quality of labor, the means of production, and surplus value. So what do these all mean? Well, one should understand that a commodity's use value is the value the object has in its using, right? A candy bar has its use value in the eating, a car has a use value in the driving, a hammer has the use value in the pounding, right? And of course, the use value can range from a very high amount to a very low amount, right? A craftsman, handmade, artisan, tool is going to be of much higher use value and quality than one, right, bought on the cheap from Walmart. It should be pretty self-evident. One can also understand, so that's use value. Then we get exchange value, and the exchange value of an object is the value it has relative to all the other objects in, right, the economy. For example, a fairly good used car has an exchange value of a fraction of a house, or numerous computers, many shirts, right, and an absolute absurd number of chicken sandwiches, right? You can interchange them, and of course, also compared to money, it's about $1,000, right? And you'll notice it can exchange through all of these different commodities, right? That's its exchange value. Now, capitalism requires a simplification of economic transactions that are brought about by the use of money, by currency. But it's really important to understand, if one wants to make a radical critique, money is not the essence of capital. It is not. Money has existed in for most of civilized human existence. Money has existed. It existed in slave societies. It existed in ancient societies. It existed in capitalist societies, and it, to a certain extent, in all existing or previously existing socialist societies, also had money. Money is not the same as capital. Money is not the same as capitalism. And so this is an important distinction that needs to be made. However, okay, so of all the commodities, right, they all function in essentially the same way, right? Of course, a chair can be used, is used differently from a car or an airplane. But the important thing is that there's nothing special or unique about them in the economy, right? It's buying a chair, buying a plane, buying a house, right? You don't have to engage in anything special. I mean, you might need to take a loan, or if you're rich enough, you could just buy them as such. But again, nothing unique. However, there is one commodity that is special, that is unique, above and beyond all other commodities. And this commodity is labor, human labor. Because labor, unlike every other commodity, produces new commodities. It is human labor that turns, right, an empty field into a farm. It is human labor that turns sleeping iron into a skyscraper. And it's human labor that turns blank pages into a poem. Human labor also must first create and give oversight to the automated factories and the computers, who in turn, right, do other things like produce automobiles. But even if you have an automatic, right, robot arm doing the work, that is ultimately grounded initially on human labor, right? So this is a unique commodity. Also, it's unique because it creates, but except for the most basic economic activities, most human labor uses tools, right? Pretty self-evident. Under the Marxian analysis, these tools are known as the means of production, right? And the means is what you use, and therefore production. So pretty self-evident, means of production. So everything from a factory to a hammer would count, right, as the means of production. And one should notice that of these things named, right, all these economic types, right, all these economic activities, they exist in pretty much every single economic and political system. None of these, either individually or collectively, are unique or make up capitalism. Capitalism is something fundamentally different from all of these parts, even if they're put together. Surplus value is the heart of capitalism. Let us return for a moment to the commodity form of labor. Now, capitalists buy and sell labor at a market price relative to every other commodity on the market. You can pay a wage, right, for about what it would cost, right, an hour of labor, what it would cost, for a so-so dinner at Applebee's, right? But, so they pay a wage or a salary or a rate, and this is the exchange value of that labor. However, unlike other commodities, they don't consume it, right, and destroy it. Instead, they put it to work. And this is the real essence of it. The work done, right, by labor is its use value, or labor power if you want to get nitpicky and overly scholastic about it. And something really, really strange happens when you put labor to work. The use value of the labor generates a new commodity. You put someone to work mining, you get ore. You put someone to work in a factory, you get, I don't know, foldable ladders. But what happens, right, is the value of this new commodity in the exchange is greater, right, than the price paid for the labor itself. And so I want to be really clear. A lot of leftists make a very facile argument, which is, well, capitalists, are just exploiting because they pay people very low wages, right? The implications of this argument is no. They pay a fair market, which is to say, relative to all the other commodities, they pay a market price for labor. They pay the exchange costs of labor. And those, right, as we'll see, I believe in the next lecture, right, those exchange costs of labor are different in different areas, right, but they're real market costs. So from the capitalist perspective, they're doing everything on the up and up. There's nothing controversial to them about what they're doing. But this difference created between the exchange value of labor, the use value where it's put to use, and the new commodity that arises from that being put to use, our foldable ladder, that difference of value is called surplus value, right? Because it's in addition. And this surplus value, most people know as profit. Surplus value, or profits, are the essence of capitalism. And most anti-capitalists call this extraction, right? This process of creating surplus value from labor, exploitation. Now, one should not devalue, right, the importance of analysis in the capitalist mode of production, right? The analysis of that is important, but that is not even close to the entire story. And unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately for you, I won't have time to go into that because we'd be here for a while. However, capitalism also functions as a political economy. Capitalism entails a whole host of political conditions to ensure the possibility of this economic system. Well, what sort of conditions? Well, capitalism has historically required a certain level of liberalism, right? That is to say that capitalism requires the conception of the individual as the primary legal, political, and economic subject. Previously, like the estate systems, right, it was the aristocrats and the clergy who had political rights as a class. And their actual individual rights were, to a certain extent, not particularly important, right? So rather than having a state, rights as a class, capitalism for its production, for its system, requires individual rights. Now, of course, when you're confronting monarchy, this makes capitalism a liberatory and revolutionary ideology, right? To assert that every individual has rights rather than, the aristocrats or the clergy as a class is a revolutionary idea. But of course, we've moved, hopefully, slightly beyond that. And so, of course, the consequence of selling labor like a commodity requires the individual to stand as a legal individual who has the legal right, as a capitalist, to buy labor, and the legal right, as a worker, to sell labor, right? So, ironically, slavery is very antithetical to capitalism. Slavery actually gums the systems because you don't have the responsiveness of buying and selling labor. You just have, right, straight up exploitation that doesn't occur between, exchange value and use value. And because you don't have that, right, you don't have this constantly circulating system of investing and producing and failure and, success, it stagnates. And so again, in this case, compared to feudalism, capitalism is an incredibly revolutionary ideology. But of course, that's compared to feudalism. So of course, right, with this background, we also have laws that must exist to protect and expand the ability of capitalism to create new markets, to hold property, and to ensure regular economic functions. Those who assert that the state exists to serve a few wealthy capitalists, like Bill Gates, or the Rothschilds, or the capitalists belonging to the Trilateral Commission, they miss the point, right? The state doesn't exist to protect any individuals. It exists to protect the system of capitalism. And so the state may, as a matter of fact, protect, an individual or a corporation based on their political connectedness, or because of, right, its necessity for the functioning of the capitalist system. In common terms, when the state protects an individual capitalist or corporation because that corporation or capitalist is essential to the functioning of the system, we know that by the term too big to fail, right? And so this is not something that has gone by the wayside. Too big to fail and the protection of individual capitalists has existed since capitalism came into being, and it will, I would wager, continue to exist as long as capitalism continues to exist. So that's, in a nutshell, capitalism as a political ideology. I'm sorry, a political economy. But also, capitalism exists as an ideology. Now, of course, understanding ideology is not a simple or clear affair. There are volumes and volumes written on ideology, and it itself, right, could be not only a lecture, but a class or a life's pursuit of research. However, we can roughly understand ideology as the assumptions necessary for us to take action. So, as Marx said, ideology is that they do it, but they don't know that they do it. So what would a capitalist ideology look like? Well, capitalist ideology confronts us with a world that seems absolutely individual and rational. We have individual economic and political agents, right? People who make self-interested, or corporations who make self-interested decisions. And then commodities exist as independent entities in their production, right? A commodity in its production is independent. A commodity in its exchange is independent. And a commodity in its consumption is independent, right? A big screen TV is, again, independent here, independent there, independent everywhere. Yeah, so. And then the state, under capitalism, while imperfect and makes mistakes, just is there to attempt to mediate and prevent conflicts between individuals, right, and corporations, so things don't get out of hand. We don't have anarchy. However, this is merely the ideological background to the real situation. Capitalism is itself a social relation which deploys vast forces and workers and repressive forces in the form of police, in the form of soldiers, in the form of militias and guerrillas and instabilities and assassinations, all for the generation of surplus value. One doesn't have a capitalist if you don't believe in, right, an individual system, right, or an individual notion of, right, wealth, that one individual can own capital. One doesn't have a factory line or an assembly line unless one believes, right, in the overarching efficacy, right, of the individualization of, right, tasks. Right? So that individuals, everything should be split up and individualized. One doesn't look at your work, right, if you work in a factory or if you work in retail, right, as just either an hour of your life sold or a bunch of products made, a bunch of commodities made to disappear, unless one already ideologically buys in that the very core of everything is individual, rather than this huge social relation that makes it possible for us to have it, right? And so this is the functioning of capitalist ideology. It makes us see an individual where in fact we have a collective, right? Any given individual on the factory line is unimportant and ineffectual. A factory works because it works in social labor. For the vast majority of people, you can only do your job if somebody before and if somebody after you does their job, right? And so this is the very meaning of social labor. Whereas previously, if you were working in a guild hall, right, you would do all the jobs yourself. You would, take the leather, bend, if you're making shoes, right? You would bend the leather yourself, you would hammer the leather yourself, you would add laces or buckles, depending on what century it is, right? And that would all be done by you. It wasn't a social form of labor. It was artisan labor, right? It was an individual doing labor. But now, all of the, and again, so much more productive, so much more revolutionary, right? Capitalist labor, as it is now, right, is so much more effectual because it is social labor, right? It is a social arrangement. And it can put us collectively to work better, right, than a king can, right, basically shaking down individual serfs or individual guild halls, right? So again, the essence of capitalist ideology is to see an individual, either an individual product or an individual person or an individual corporation or an individual state, whereas in fact it's a huge interconnected social arrangement. Okay. Well, why does capitalism continue to function in this, right? If it was just repression, it wouldn't fly. Repressive regimes are not always, but usually toppled, right, through resistance. Capitalism actually has one unique lever of power that trumps all the others. You can have the tanks, you can have the bombs, you can have the soldiers, you can have the guns, you can have the cops, you can have all the laws. But the real power of capitalism arises because they control the means of production. Because ideologically, we see property as individually owned, and right, again, corporations are just shorthand for another individual, right, corporate individual. Because we see property as individually owned, it seems perfectly commonsensical that we should sell ourselves either to this factory or this retail shop or that restaurant. And so we have this ostensible freedom, this liberty to do whatever we want. But because the means of production are universally owned or increasingly owned by capitalists, right, they control the very ways in which we live, right? A factory farm is how most of us eat. And that's an important word, a factory farm, right? And who controls that? A capitalist. And so, and again, I know we're non-tendency, but I'm going to take the Marxist tract here. So this separates us into a class, right? It separates us into the class that owns the means of production, that owns the factories, owns the farms, and it separates us into a class of people who don't own anything, but or very little, as far as social relations go, except our bodies to sell, hour by hour, right? And these are the workers, or in other terms, the proletariat. So obviously, I could continue to go on about, you know, the functioning of capital, but this, I think, is the main power of capitalism, right? The control of the means of production. So when you think of capitalism, one should never just think of, right, the Econ 101, supply and demand. One should realize capitalism is a unique form of production. It is a unique form of political economy. And it is a unique ideology. And I'll just wrap this up. We're also in a very dangerous state right now. Because as a matter of fact, historically, capitalism, for all of its flaws, and of course, I'm anti-capitalist, so I think it has many, capitalism has historically been linked to liberalism, right? The notion of individual liberties, individual freedom, individual rights. And a lot of the rights that we benefit from are outgrowths of liberalism, and indirectly outgrowths of capitalism. However, currently it seems that capitalism is changing its face. And we see the rising of capitalist societies, especially in Asia. And of course, right, you can debate the People's Republic of China, right, as one of these, and I would say that it is, but also South Korea, right, also Thailand, also Singapore, also Taiwan, where you have repressive political regimes that continue, right, the capitalist mode of production, right? Economic liberty, right, in the sense of, you know, unrestricted, unfettered markets, but absolute political repression. So again, this is an introduction to capitalism. I can't do terribly much more than that. But I think this would provide a good stepping stone for any radical analysis, or to simply approach capitalism, right, if you enjoy capitalism, from, right, another perspective that will perhaps be helpful or enlightening to you. So I guess I'll wrap it up there. I hate to put a damper on any discussion, but you guys had time to talk, time to argue, time to come up with questions. So now that you have, I'm just going to kind of go through the room. If you have any questions or comments or criticisms, just raise your hand, let me know, and I'd be happy to answer anything I can. So we're good to go?
Yeah, we're recording right now. Matt?
Rob had his hand up.
No, mine was... All right, cool.
Okay.
Take it away, Comrade Rob.
Okay, so one thing we thought should probably be brought up in an introduction to capitalism is what happens with capitalism over time. While there is the meritocratic presentation where we pretend and we say that people who do well and perform well are being rewarded for contributing to society, and those who don't are simply not. The structure over time is that those who have money gain more money simply by having that money. The surplus value is what they can buy and purchase and then resell for a greater and greater value over time. Whereas those who do not have money, do not have power, do not have influence, have less and less power over time. And then it creates this gap, this differentiation between the classes where it's no longer meritocratic, but reward for having money and punishment for not having money or power in the first place. Just thought that should be thrown out there, and wondering if you had any comments on that.
Yeah, actually, my comments are this. I can understand that, and most leftists want to make that critique, right? Because I didn't get into it. But one of the myths of capitalism is if you work hard, you get rewarded for that. And of course, right, there's Paris Hilton, and there's the banks that got bailed out, and you can pick your example. But there's something really, I don't mean to be super critical. There's something really flawed with the leftist critique of the meritocratic state, which I think I actually addressed in the presentation, which is this notion that there's individuals over time who become strong, powerful capitalists and marginalize other people. We never had that. We never had a system of individuals competing in a market and then gaining more and more power. We have always had a system where the state has intervened and supported capitalist accumulation in order to have power. The East India Company, goes back, if I'm remembering correctly, to Elizabeth I, right? And the supports of that go back to Elizabeth I. And so basically the critique against, I understand why leftists do the critique of meritocracy, but I think that bites a bad hook. And that's that capitalism was ever meritocratic. And I think there's no justification for us even thinking that, just historically speaking. So I understand why people would make that critique. I'm just telling you why I didn't make that critique, is because I don't think that critique needs to be made, because there was never a time in which it was true. Right? It's a myth. Does that answer your...
Yes, though I think that in an introduction to capitalism it is still, since it is a very common belief for people who support capitalism.
Okay. Fair enough.
We had a bit of confusion, right? So China ostensibly is not a communist country, and we have this notion of, Slavoj Žižek puts it, capitalism with Asian values. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you see a distinction between that and actual fascism.
Yeah, this is a really difficult question that goes to a really deep theoretical level. And it would be better served to discuss in a lecture on fascism proper. But I think the fundamental distinction, this is what keeps authoritarian capitalist regimes proper from being fascist. Although there's certainly fascistic elements that overlap, fascism needs to externalize its threat to some other. You look at any fascist regime, like declared fascist, and you have this externalization of the other. Our entire system would be absolutely perfect if only we got rid of those X. In Italy, it's anyone who doesn't support Italian nationalism. So any leftists or anarchists or syndicalists, if we just got rid of those dirty, Reds, then, Italy would be wonderful. And interestingly enough, they didn't actually have a very strong racial component. It wasn't the Jews who got most of that externalization. But in Nazi Germany, of course, the quintessential, people think of it as the quintessential example of fascism, right? If only we got rid of those dirty Jews, then our system would be perfect. In Spain, you have, if only we got rid of those dirty atheists, right, and leftists. And you get a similar thing, right, in Pinochet. I consider Pinochet's system fascist. And you get a similar feeling towards, again, atheists and leftists, and so they're summarily executed. But authoritarian capitalism doesn't concern itself with that. It doesn't think, oh, there is this class or group of people outside of our society working to undermine our society, and if we only got rid of them or killed them, then everything would work fine. They're actually much more pragmatic, which is this. We have a giant state apparatus of police and prisons, both secret and hidden, and anyone who messes, for whatever reason, with our production, with our economy, with our political system as it is, will be dealt with summarily. A good example of this, for example, as far as I understand it, there are complexities that I am not privy to in Iran, and I know that a lot of leftists will flinch when hearing this. But, for example, in Iran, the suppression of protesters, even if they are liberal, which I believe they are, right, isn't a matter of them being, at its core, you know, evil foreign agents under the pay of the United States, even if they are. The real core is you're disrupting our society, so you're going to be suppressed. You get the same thing in South Korea and the People's Republic of China. I mean, and there are fascistic elements, but it's you're messing with our production, your strike, your demand for political equality, your demand for social services. You're messing with our production. That's why you're going to disappear. So this I think is not fascistic. But I do think this is the trend towards where capitalism is headed. And we can see it around the world quite clearly. And we can also see it very easily in the United States, where slowly but surely our liberal rights are being whittled away, so that if you are interfering with capitalist production, be you a leftist or a small business owner, you will face suppression of one form or another.
It's just a question of, you know, it's not a political question per se, but whatever political establishment that you have, whatever country it is or state, I think to a degree, maybe not entirely, but to a degree, that a value system, some type of system of values, has to be accounted for, and that will help determine how that political whatever is going to turn out, whether it's socialist or capitalist or communist, whatever it is. There's got to be an accounting of the actual moral fiber of that country, because, say, for some of the things I think about these days is, are there more police because, at least to a degree, because the moral fiber is having a hard time, and so they have to increase because people are making maybe not the best decisions or whatever it is, because people make poor choices. I do, a lot of people do. And so they try to enforce to keep the rules, and so they have to make more rules to keep people from making poor decisions. And so at least it has to be considered, not just entirely, but considered as something to think about when developing whatever political system we come up with.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And in fact, the vast majority of the world is capitalist, and we can see this playing out, right? Capitalism is itself, right, again, a mode of production, a political economy, and an ideology, but it's too simple to say that it is a total, right, mode of production. It is a total political economy. It is a total ideology, right? Its very effectiveness is it remains incomplete and incorporates whatever aspect of that culture that is necessary. For example, here, right, we enjoy, maybe just abstractly, although I would say probably more concretely, we enjoy violence. And capitalism is really good at giving us violence. We have a lot of violent movies, we have a lot of violent TV shows, and the video games, let's be frank, are pretty awesome. Right, but if you go to Europe, right, but we hate sex, or to a certain degree, we don't like it as a big functioning part of our economy. But you go to Germany, or you go to Japan, right, and capitalism incorporates those values, and you have pornography everywhere. Right? So yeah, I completely agree, regardless of the political or economic system, right, you're never going to have a purity. Right? And again, this is why capitalism is so smart. Maybe at one point, capitalism was a Western European idea, but its very effectiveness, and what we're seeing now in Asia, especially, right, is capitalism can adapt itself to social conditions and social values that are prevalent in the society. And this is part of its resilience, right, is to put it coarsely and like in a very oversimplified fashion, right, capitalism gives people what they want, usually to the lowest common denominator. Again, that's more problem. But yeah, I would agree completely. Yes?
Greg, something, when I was listening to, what's your name saying?
Josh.
Josh, from what I understood that you were saying also was that you were talking about the lack of like sort of like a moral framework, like there's not like or what we have, because capitalism is sort of overcome our political reality, that it's not grounded in like any deep morality. And so as a result, for example, when you're talking about criminals, how do we deal with them, or the eruption in crime, a way to simplify that is how do we resolve conflict, right? But in a capitalist society, we aren't concerned necessarily with resolving conflict. We're concerned with making money off of criminals. And so you look at the prisons, like the expanse of the prison system, or as becoming this huge, complex to make money off of criminals. So everything becomes about there is not really, I would argue, there isn't a moral framework because it isn't grounded in any sort of like true morality, or at least as concerned with the flourishing of the human being, which I think sounds like what you were saying. I just wanted to add that in. What I was saying.
Yeah, and I would completely agree with that. I mean, I've probably said this to many of you, right? If George Bush invades Iraq, he does so because it will serve the interests of the capitalist class. If Barack Obama wants to withdraw from Iraq, he does so because he believes it will serve the interests of the capitalist class. So, I mean, let me put it in that exact framework. In the United States, it serves the capitalist class to criminalize a lot of people because we've privatized large chunks of our prison industry, large chunks of our security industry. And so here, right, those who are in the know, even if they don't consciously identify as capitalism, the actual interests they serve, right, is to generate profit through capital, right, through this prison system, and they generate that. But if you look at Japan, right, and a lot of European criminal systems, as a matter of fact, they're very lenient, incredibly lenient. I mean, murder, you're looking at, in Sweden, you're looking at 20 years, right, or somewhere around there. In Japan, you can actually get your sentence reduced if you apologize and have heartfelt, sincere apology. And this happens frequently. Now, what should we make of this? That, the liberal, Europeans are more enlightened, and the Japanese have this, residual sense of honor that one can apologize and it makes it good? No, not at all. What they think is, no, the costs to us of criminalizing people ultimately are going to cost a lot more than the profits we would make off of criminalizing people. And so it makes sense. Why would you criminalize someone when you can put them in, for marijuana, for example, when you can put them in rehab, 6 months later, they'll be out working their job, right? And so it's not necessarily any high-minded, and I think you're absolutely right. It's not any high-minded moral core that's at play. Although morality is at play. I mean, this is what makes ideology so powerful. You do not have scheming capitalists going, I bet I can squeeze another penny from them. They do it, and they don't know that they do it. They think, oh man, these criminals, they're overrunning our society, we've got to criminalize all of them, right? And what interest does it serve? It serves the capitalist interest. You have Europeans who think, oh, we don't want to be like those barbaric Americans, so we should have our enlightened, what's the term? This enlightened change in our criminals, and rehabilitation of these criminals, right? And so they think this, they believe this is their moral position, but as a matter of fact, its real function is to continue to serve production, to serve capital. Will, sorry.
Just to kind of add to what you're saying. I've found that a lot of times the people that come up with certain ideas or ideologies don't do it for the sake of profit and so forth. But then the forces that get behind those ideas and promote them are those forces who are doing it for the sake of profit. So even like Milton Friedman, for example, who was kind of the founder of free market economics as we've known it in this last half century, the Chicago School, where came up with all the reforms that were made in Chile and things like that when Pinochet was in power, and in a lot of other places, China as well. You know, he's a professor at the University of Chicago, and he's making his money. He's got tenure, and it doesn't really he doesn't like make a ton of money by the fact that this ideology is broadly accepted throughout the world. But then again, different forces come and latch onto those ideologies or those ideas and promote them for the sake of making money. Same thing with the people who maybe wanted to initially invade Iraq, like say, you know, you've got think tanks in Washington, the Heritage Foundation or whatever, Project for the New American Century, or all these different things. They put out these ideas like, hey, we should invade Iraq for this and this reason. But then, of course, arms industry, different companies, et cetera, they then have their lobbyists that then promote those ideas because they're going to make money on it, and eventually it just, you know, gains some steam. Whereas ideas that don't serve the capitalist class are still out there in U.S. society, and they exist, but they don't get any promotion or marketing or backing, and so they just remain obscure and no one really knows about it.
Yeah, I mean, and it's good that you bring up Iraq. A really, in my position, a really stupid leftist critique is this. The only reason we went into Iraq was for the oil, right? You hear this all the time, and that's really stupid. No, as a matter of fact, if most of these neocons genuinely believe in the values they're espousing, they believe, you know, that the human rights in Iraq were terrible, which they, you know, relative to Western, you know, democracies, they were, right? That Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, he was. But the problem is this ideological function blocks what is really going to happen. I mean, if I may, off subject for a moment, there's a very brilliant American philosopher, Donald Rumsfeld, who said a very profound thing. He said, look, there are known knowns, which are things that we know. There are known unknowns, which are things we know that we don't know. And there are unknown unknowns, which are things that we don't know we know. Or we don't know that we don't know, right? This is unknown unknowns. But you'll notice this is a box. And one of the boxes is missing. And the box that is missing are unknown knowns. Things we don't know that we know. When the United States invades countries, right, it turns into bloody guerrilla warfare, protracted over years, with political instability, with people profiteering off of it. We know this. Every time we go to war, we get this. But we don't know it. We don't know that we know it, right? And so this is the functioning of ideology at play under capitalism. And like you said, it's a very stupid thing to think all these people are disingenuous and lying to us when they say they care about human rights. The only problem is they don't know what they know, right? Maybe, oh yeah, sorry.
This is going back to an early comment, and I may be off the mark here, but how does a prison generate capital?
That's a very good question. Actually, so when you have a public prison, right, you have taxpayers paying for it. But when you have a private prison, you have investors or an owner, right, who gets paid usually, not always, usually they get paid per prisoner. So the state says, look, private industry, somehow, it's usually not really specified, private industry runs prisons better than the government does. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you this amount of money, and you need to run the prison for each prisoner for this amount of money. So, you know, like $6,000 a year. So each prisoner, they get $6,000 a year. Well, of course, how would you generate profit on that? Don't use $6,000 a year, right? And to be fair, right, this is the joy of the market system. In principle, a prison could go bankrupt, right, if they spend $7,000 a year or $9,000 or whatever. But again, something funny happens. One is they're given $6,000. Well, and actually, sometimes they're given profit. I forget the exact term. You might want to check out Naomi Klein's shock doctrine. She talks about that in there. You get a guaranteed profit. Halliburton in Iraq got a guaranteed profit, which is, look, this is a really dangerous activity. Your private company will pay cost plus 5%. So we'll pay all your costs, and then we'll pay 5% in addition, right? But if you buy things from yourself, which happens a lot under, capitalism, and you buy them for a very expensive price, you can generate a lot of profit, right? This is how Medicare gets so bloated and Medicaid. And prisons, right? If you have a prison system which is profit plus, what is a really good idea, right? And this should sound really familiar. You have your prisoners make jumpsuits and clothing, and then you have them sell it to you at cost. And then you sell it to the prison for a huge markup, right? And this happens. This happens all the time in America. And why? Because they're private prisons. And what's the purpose of a business? To generate surplus value. And so that would be how a prison makes money.
I guess I was thinking more of a state prison systems.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's very difficult for a state prison system to make money. And when they do make money, it's usually from corruption. And in principle, usually when a warden or someone is making money off a prison, even if they don't get caught, they're usually breaking the law. And so that's an important distinction. Whereas if a warden is making money off a private prison, he's just a very good entrepreneur.
Okay.
One more.
Yeah, I mean, it's just worth pointing out a very concrete example of that is a judge that just recently got busted in Pennsylvania for throwing juveniles into facilities for just outrageously petty crimes like arguing with their parents and stuff. The reason that this is also because they do get paid by the bed, right? And of course they make more money because they cut down on these costs and such by getting more prisoners. So all you need to do is talk, a little background thing. It's you talk to your buddy and you're like, hey, can you put more kids in prison? I'll give you a cutback, and he literally did. So
yeah,
it's not always that villainous, but that's just a concrete example.
Okay, well, let's grab a hand for his efforts.